Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by the outset of this debate by thanking those on the ground who care so passionately about delivering Scotland's ferry services, those working on board our vessels, in our ports and harbours, and those welding the sheets of our future fleet. But I do so in the knowledge that they are working in a difficult climate, under contracts largely outside of their control, on vessels they often did not choose or design, and in a climate where their repeated calls for adequate investment is going unnoticed and ignored. Our criticisms today will reflect the strength of feeling on this matter right across Scotland. Our criticism is focused squarely at the door of the government, which after a decade in office has yet to deliver a sustainable, fit-for-purpose fleet and network of ferries in Scotland. A government that is presiding over an ageing fleet of vessels, with no real standardisation between vessel and port, with little to no resilience within that fleet, and which is dogmatic in its pursuit of directly awarding contracts, and which has, if it's very brief, got a lot to get through.
Minister.
It is now, thank you. If the member is making his assertions about the role of the Scottish Government, will he not recognise that over the last decade now we have faced increasing austerity, certainly since 2010? And it's not a minor matter. The member might ignore this, but there's been £1.9 billion real terms cut in the Scottish Government's budget in 2019-20 as a result of your government.
Mr Greene, don't fret. I will give you your time back, but you mustn't get up and stand while another member is speaking, anxious though you are. Mr Greene.
Thank you so much, Presiding Officer. My goodness, the Minister has an absolute cheek to stand up and tell this chamber that it's somebody else's fault that the ferry services in Scotland are not up to scratch. It's always somebody else's fault, Minister, but I would advise you to listen to not just what we have to say, but members right across this chamber from every part of Scotland. Listen to us and listen to the people out there who have to rely on those services. We've brought forward this debate because of those voices right across Scotland, not experts in the marine industry, but the people to whom the ferry services matter the most, like the farmer who contacted me from Arran, who cannot get his livestock to the market on the mainland. Why? Because of a lack of commercial space on the vessel. Like the tourists I met, sitting in a queue outside my office in Largs, come down from Glasgow for the day to take his family to Millport for a day trip, but spent 3 hours queuing to get a seat on a vessel that takes 8 minutes to cross to Cumbria. Or even worse, like Monty Phillips, a carer who was forced to sleep in a grit bin overnight because the last ferry to Dunoon was cancelled, and the terminal staff would not even let her sleep in the waiting room. Outrageous, shocking stories of people being let down. The fact is that since the SNP came to power, there have been over 70,000 ferry delays or cancellations across Scotland. That's 177 sailings a week in Scotland being disrupted. And it's quite timely that today's debate comes as the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee released a letter to the Transport Secretary, who I notice is absent from today's debate, summarising its findings on ferry funding as part of budget scrutiny. This report, Minister, makes for some very difficult reading. I advise you to read it very, very carefully. And perhaps if you had read it, you may have submitted a more realistic and self-aware amendment to the one you submitted today. The REC Committee was told that ferry services and its infrastructure have suffered from a lengthy period of underinvestment. In its evidence to the committee, CalMac's Managing Director described the 2018 summer disruption as the worst in 8 years. He told the committee that in terms of backup vessels, CalMac has no spare assets, no spare fleet, and its staff are working at their absolute capacity just to maintain the status quo. If a single vessel is out of service, it disrupts the entire network for weeks at a time, as was the case when the NV Clansman was out of service. And to be fair to Mr Drummond, it's not CalMac's fault. They're working with the contracts and the fleet they have available to them. The committee took a number of evidence sessions from a wide range of stakeholders, and these are some of the concerns that they raised. The lack of vessel capacity for vehicles, investment not matching increased growth from tourism, insufficient integration with mainland transport, a focus on procuring larger, more expensive vessels, which limits their ability to move vessels between one port and another, or to between one service and another. And I know there are a wide range of views in this Parliament on who should or shouldn't operate our ferries. But when the government did run a tender for CHIFs, the process was complex, inflexible, expensive, and actually discouraged innovative bids. The committee noted that investment in port infrastructure and vessels, quite simply, is not meeting demand. CMAL's chief executive told the REC committee that the annual investment he thought needed was £30 million per year on vessels and £20 million per year on harbours. It has been receiving just half of that. So it's no huge surprise to anyone that there is so much disruption on our fleets. But, Presiding Officer, there's a wider problem here. Last year's report on ferries by Audit Scotland warned that this long-term lack of investment and vision, along with skyrocketing subsidies and limited finances, could be detrimental to the long-term viability of Scotland's ferries. In their words, they said, there is no Scotland-wide long-term strategy. Transport Scotland will find it challenging to continue to provide ferry services that meets the needs of users within its allocated budget. But this isn't the future. I would argue that this is already the case. So in that context, I'm pleased to agree with Labour's amendment today. On these benches, we share their aspiration for a government which produces a 30-year plan for both shipbuilding and ferry replacement. It's a sensible addition to the debate, and I would ask other members to support it as well. The industry has been saying this for years. Even as far back as 2011, the Scottish Government acknowledged itself. It said, we are faced with significant and growing increases in both resource and capital costs to maintain existing ferry services. It is clear that we are not able to deliver all of our improvements to ferry services. And since the introduction of RET, the reality is that demand has simply outstripped supply. And who is suffering the most in all of this? It is our island communities. The government's amendment today simply does one thing. It deletes my motion. It says, and it notes that people are concerned and they're frustrated. Presiding Officer, today's award for the biggest understatement goes to Paul Wheelhouse. We called for this debate today because enough simply is enough. For too long, the Scottish Government has ignored repeated warnings from the industry. The public are sick and tired of the disruption, of the delays, and of the cancellations. They were promised new vessels. They haven't arrived. They asked for one type of vessel, and they were delivered another. They were promised that their needs would be put first, and instead they're queuing for hours on end to get a ferry home. I would urge all members in the chamber today to listen to the many stories and anecdotes you will hear from the length and breadth of Scotland, and rather than pretend that the status quo is acceptable, as the government wants you to do, stand up and stick up for your island communities, because that's what we will do. I move the motion in my name.